I guess we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming to our session, Remote Entities, Past, Present, and Future. Some of you might have noticed that we actually renamed this recently. Before it was called Remote Entities, Standardizing External Integrations, but I already actually did that presentation at DrupalCon Barcelona, and we have a unique opportunity where we have Colin, who wrote a really fantastic write-up on how to use remote entities. We're both here, so we thought it'd be a great opportunity to kind of talk about where the solution has been, where it is right now, and kind of where we see it going. I'm Dave and Colan. I'm an architect for Autodesk Consumer Group. I've been a full-time Drupal developer for over 5 years, web developer for 7. I'm steel track on Drupal.org, and I have a couple of contributed modules.
Hi everybody, I'm Colin, COLAN on Drupal.org. I'm an enterprise web architect specializing in Drupal. Traditionally an independent contractor, but I'm working more and more for Chapter 3 these days because they're awesome. And I've been doing this Drupal thing for almost 10 years, since 2006. I've contributed to over 30 modules. I co-maintain about 20, including views. Anybody heard of that? Views? No? Okay. Great. So, let's begin.
Cool, so we'll start off talking about kind of setting the stage for what remote entities are and why you would even consider them. For us, we had a project where we had to integrate Drupal with a REST API service, and it contained tens of millions of data assets that can be updated every second by millions of users. So one of the things we had to figure out before we could start figuring out what was the right solution was we had to set very clear criteria for how we would judge different solutions. So we came up with 3 major criteria for this. You have to consider the consistency of the data. The consistency is how similar are your data objects to each other. Are you dealing with a lot of really bad, dirty data, like weird encoding issues, things like that? Another thing you have to consider is the size of the data set. If you're just importing, say, 1,000 items from an Excel file, that's fairly trivial. But when you start getting into the tens of millions, then the time it takes Drupal itself to just bootstrap can add up to a point where it's taking hours. I was working on one particular project where we were doing a ebook e-commerce store, and we were contractually obligated every 24 hours to update our book catalog based on whatever data the publisher gave us. And using the migrate module, we were actually getting to a point where our migration was taking more than 24 hours in order to import the full data set. The third criteria we were talking about was, what is the maximum tolerance you have for stale data? So going back to the book example, the name of an author is probably very unlikely to change daily. But for us in our project, we had a community service in which people were commenting, liking, editing what they're creating literally every second. So we started kind of looking at the different common external data integration approaches for Drupal. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen some of these before. The first and most common is going to be a data migration approach. So one example of this is you have some sort of migration that happens at a standard interval. So this is like you have feeds run every night at midnight. Another example is you have a data migration on a non-standard interval. So this is where you have some sort of marketing person uploads a spreadsheet, hits migrate, and then migrate module imports everything into Drupal. The pros for this are it's going to be really much easier to debug edge cases and look for dirty data, because once your migration's done, you're going to see really quickly like, oh, were my rows screwed up? Did the right data go in the right fields? It's performant once it's done. During the migration, depending what you're doing, if you have field collections and a lot of entity saving going on, it can actually get pretty brutal. But once it's done, It's all in Drupal. And the other thing is, once again, it's native in Drupal. So you're going to be able to use views, content types, entity referencing, all the things that you're used to. The cons for this are that you're going to have stale data, right? You're dependent on this cron running every night at midnight, or some marketing admin updating their spreadsheet and uploading it. In addition, monolithic data updates are risky. And what I mean by that is when you update your entire data set at one time. Because if, for example, you have an error in your migration, then you've potentially destroyed tens of thousands of rows of data in your system, and you're going to have to very quickly correct that. Also, like I mentioned before, some of these data migrations can take a very long time. Another common thing you'll see is kind of the non-Drupal PHP approach. So this is where some vendor gives you, they're like, oh yeah, we have a PHP library, and you end up just kind of like stitching it wherever it makes sense. The problem with this approach is, what's good about this approach is you're not going to have any stale data necessarily if you're just grabbing things on the fly. And with Symfony integration in Drupal 8, like non-Drupal PHP is a lot less scary. But the cons are it's going to require a lot of glue work because you're essentially going to take this kind of custom PHP library and then just stitch it into whatever you need. Endpoints, form API, theme hooks, you're going to have to do all of it from scratch. So tight Drupal integration is going to be very expensive for that project. In addition, your performance is going to be entirely dependent on an external data source because you're going to be making server-side calls to that source. And then we have the kind of like no-vu approach, right, where this is the Angular or Ajax approach, where on the client side, you have some sort of, the simplest is you just have some sort of script running, does an Ajax call, fills in something on the page. Or you get into the kind of thing where you have like an embedded Angular JS app. And Drupal is kind of doing the header and the footer, and then you have this Angular app kind of in the center of the screen that's just basically totally decoupled from Drupal. It just happens to have all the window dressing done by Drupal. But the pros for this are that you're not going to have any stale data because you're just doing all these live calls to the external data source. It's also going to be extremely performant because you're doing non-blocking calls on the client side. But the big cons for this, and this is kind of the cons with using client-side libraries like Angular and Drupal, are that you're going to end up with two theme systems, right? You're going to end up with a set of templates that defines how your client-side MVC works that are different from your set of Drupal templates that are defining what your server-side is rendering. So you basically have like a separate layer just sitting on top of Drupal. From a UX perspective, when you go to some of these pages, your page can be totally empty on load, right? Like, as the worst case scenario, you just go and you have nothing, and then all of a sudden it's like, bang, there's your Angular app, right? In addition, and for some people this is an issue, for some people it's not, it requires a really wide skill set, right? Because you have to have someone who knows Angular or Backbone or whatever, then they're going to have to know PHP templating or Twig. They're going to have to know, how to embed these things in a Drupal. They're going to have to know hook system. It's a really wide skill set, and it can be hard to put together a team that's got all of that.
So what if we could have native Drupal integration and no stale data? So I don't know if you're all familiar with the concept of entities in Drupal, Drupal 7 and up. So that's basically anything that can have its own fields. So in Drupal 7, that's nodes, users, taxonomy terms, beans and field collections. There's some contrib modules that are entities. So if we want to tightly integrate with Drupal, we need to, we can do that with entities because the entity APIs allow us to define custom ones that we can use, and then we can define where the storage, so that can be remote, it can be local, it can be whatever you want. So if we take a series of modules and stack them up, we can get everything we need to integrate tightly with Drupal. So we have the core entity API, which provides the basic functionality we need to use entities. Then there's the contributed module entity API, which gives us a little bit more. Now we have the remote entity API, which goes on top of that, and then EFQ views, which we'll talk about a bit later, which provides the views integration. Do entities have to live locally? I guess not. Why did we have that slide there? Anyway, okay, so history of remote entities. I'll just talk a little bit about the past, so we know where we are now. So in 2009, Larry Garfield, or Krell, as most of you would know him, wrote an article called Remote Data in Drupal, Museums and the Web. And he talked a lot about this topic. This was in the Drupal 6 days. And so back then, there wasn't really, core or contrib didn't really provide much in the way of doing this. So the solution was basically a hook menu implementation with custom code. So that did the node loading, did everything. And then you have to do your own presentation, all that kind of stuff. There was some discussion about using per field storage, and then actually got into Drupal core, where each field can have its own backend storage. That got tossed, just because it's really inefficient. If you're loading an entire entity, you don't want to have to go and grab every single field of that from a different place. So that's now out. In Drupal 8, actually, fields are stored as part of the entity itself, so that does make it easier. But again, we'll talk about that later. So it happened several years later in 2012. Florian Loritan wrote remote entities in Drupal 7. So now we're in Drupal 7, so we have the entity API in core, the entity API contrib module, and entity field query views backend, which does the views integration, as I mentioned. So what he suggested was, it was before EFQ views supported this. So what he had to do was basically take EFQ views, clone it, and do custom views support, which wasn't great and isn't really, a good general way to handle that. So now we have that, it's a little bit better. So a few years later, still in Drupal 7, but we can do a lot more. Sure.
So there's now a module called Remote Entity API. This has been around for a couple years now, maybe 2 years. So the idea with this is, because every entity has the ability to have its own custom controller, you have control over what a load method does, what a save method does. And so by default in Drupal, it's going to assume that you are performing all these functions locally into a SQL backend. But you actually have the ability to instead perform these operations on any storage system that you want. So the Remote Entity API module basically provides a set of interfaces that allow you to design an entity that performs all its operations on remote data rather than local data. The big pros of this are that it's going to be tightly integrated with Drupal. You're going to get Drupal theming, display modes, field API. You can actually have remote data and put local fields onto that data. So if you're loading an external user object, you can actually go ahead and add native to just that Drupal site and store it just in that Drupal's SQL table, like, are they signed up for a newsletter? You also can get views integration. And that's where this starts getting really crazy, because with views, you can do all sorts of cool stuff, right? Like you can do contextual filters, where you say, I want to pull in all recipes that are tagged with chili when I'm on a page that is also tagged with chili, right? And so what you can actually start doing is then say, oh, actually, this tag, though, is a remote data property. And so I'm actually performing a search on remote data, but it's all using the views interface that we all know. The big cons of the Remote Entity API approach are, by default, it saves data locally. Also, the performance is going to be entirely dependent on your external data source, right? This has always been the problem with server-side calls, is that if you have a really slow REST API, it's going to take exactly that amount of time before you're going to get any sort of response back to the user. Also, you know, it's funny, experimental is the word I use. I actually talked to the maintainer of this module, and he's like, I don't know if I would call it experimental. So, but I would say more, it's not a mainstream solution yet. So yeah.
So I can talk a little bit about how I got going with the project where I needed this. It actually started as a potential client project. I was talking to these folks on the phone, and they told me what they wanted to do. They wanted to have Drupal just be a front-end website, and there wouldn't be any data stored in Drupal at all. It would just be, there'd be communication with the REST layer where all the back-end data would be stored. So they asked me if I thought this was a good idea. And I said, no, that's actually a terrible idea. The reason is because the way Drupal has generally been going in a direction where it's used as a data store, and then other front-end technologies will handle the presentation. So for example, mobile apps, JavaScript, that kind of thing, because Drupal is generally considered slow, and those can be done quicker. So these guys were basically doing the opposite of what everybody else was doing, but it sounded like a fun challenge, and they hired me when I said it was a terrible idea. So I thought it'd be fun. So when working on this, it was tricky because I had to piece together very sparse documentation. There's a book, Programming Drupal 7 Entities, which has a chapter on it, but again, it's not comprehensive. And then the Remote Entity API maintainer has a reference implementation module, Microsoft Dynamics, I think, that's also doesn't have everything you would need, and it was written specifically for that implementation. So there were these large holes in how one would do this generically. So I spent a lot of time debugging, trying to get this up and running. I missed half of DrupalCon often because I was working on this. I needed to get it done. But you know, eventually I was able to get these things loaded and get it hooked up to views. So a lot of work, but it's definitely doable. And I was actually able to write a partially comprehensive article on this. Dave mentioned this earlier, so that's on my website. Well, there'll be a link to that later, on how to start wiring this stuff up. So Dave actually went a lot further. He was able to get remote saving done. I didn't need that for my implementation. Now,
it's a demo.
Demo, are we going to do that? Yeah? Okay, here we go. Here's the demo.
Cool. So I know bullet points aren't terribly exciting. So what I want to show all of you is what you actually get when you implement this. I think personally, it's one of the most exciting things I've seen in Drupal in a very long time. And I think if you have a similar use case to one I described, where you have to integrate external data, and it's a huge data set and cannot be stale, but you really don't want to go this client-side route, like this can be the answer for your project. So what I'm going to show you here is I'm actually going to go create a view. All of the data that you're going to see being pulled in is all coming from a remote REST API. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new view. And a lot of you, when you see views pulling in remote data, it's because you've written a custom query backend for it. That is not the case here. What you're seeing is because we defined an entity and all the properties on that entity, all of those properties are going to be available to us in views. In addition, you can see, because we're dealing with entities, we can just render it. And then, so all of the templates you would expect, like no-teaser, no-full, it's the same here, where you have custom entity-teaser, custom entity-full. Pagination is going to work. You can turn on Ajax, for example. And then what you're going to see here is, I'm creating a gallery of penguins. So the first thing I'm going to do is just generically query my REST API. And I'm just going to go ahead and say when value is equal to penguin. Right? This is all totally just because I defined a property on my entity. In addition, I'm going to say this is for kids, so I want to make sure that I'm putting false for anything that's mature. I can also then say I'm going to sort by date and I'm going to sort it descending. That's another property that I've defined on my custom entity. Entity API then handles all of the integration with views for me without writing a custom query backend. So now I'm going to go ahead and edit my landing page. We use the paragraphs module for our project. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you check it out. And we're going to go ahead and add a dynamic content block because we created our view as a block. So you'll see here, I just go find it, Penguin Gallery block, and hit save. And what you're going to see here is my gallery already looks totally great. Because I'm just rendering it as an entity, and I'm just using my entity templates I already have. Pagination works totally fine. This is all being pulled entirely from a remote data source. But I'm getting all of the user experience for content editor that I would expect with Drupal. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to explicitly add certain remote items that I want. So before we were just saying do a search for penguins, but now I'm going to say, oh, I want item 12 and item 15, and it's almost like saying I want featured items versus I just want a generic list of items. Right now, what I'm opening up here is entity reference views widget, which allows you to use a view for your entity referencing. So right now, I'm doing a search on remote data using the same views mechanism I had before. I go ahead and choose this guy, those fun penguins, and then that cool little thing. When I hit submit, you can see it's just like if I had just referenced some users or referenced some nodes local in Drupal. And when I hit save, it's actually going to save into Drupal the entity reference IDs, even though those entities happen to be remote. And there you have it, all perfectly themed because once again, they're just rendering as an entity.
Can you show the structure, please, for the entity?
What do you mean show the structure?
The code?
How it's, where it's defined.
We'll get to that. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a slide or two. So.
Yeah, we'll get to that for sure. Anyway, pretty cool, right? Yeah. I mean, slow clap. I mean, honestly, think about how powerful this is. Normally, you'd have some Angular app, and you'd have to say to your dev, hey, we need some new a gallery embedded, or we need to add a bunch of filters, or we need to create some new custom thing that, like, Drupal pushes out a JSON object that customizes our Angular app and whatever. And with this, all the native tools that we use to sell Drupal, sell these projects to begin with, panels, views, fields, we get all of it, but it's all with remote data. But it's not all great, is it, Colin?
It's not all great. So there's some issues with this approach. As I sort of mentioned before, there's some great documentation written by the Remote Entity API maintainer, but there's still some big holes. There definitely could be more docs on that. We need one or more complete working examples. That's really what's missing. I've started getting comments on my people have contacted me about my article saying, although I didn't have a lot of code there, they're saying they really want a full working example, and the client for which I did this, I haven't got their consent to publish it, but maybe I'll be able to do that. So that's an issue. If we get another good example out there, that would be great. Another problem is this API is set up such that you always have local copies, and you may not want to do that. Like, let's say you have your front-end web servers, you don't want to store data there because firewall has security issues. You may want to have that, another level of firewall where you keep your data, that kind of thing. Like in our case, we just overrode the save method and set it to false. We set the expiry time to 0 for refreshing, that sort of thing. You can write a completely new handler if you want. That's what Dave did. It's also confusing.
I'll talk about this point before caching.
Oh, okay, yeah, here's Dave on caching.
So one thing I want to mention here too is that the demo I showed you, we actually had customized remote entity API so that we did not do any local saving. And I talked to the maintainer of the module, and he said the reason he was saving items locally was because for him it was a caching mechanism. However, I told him that architecturally saving an entity is different than using the caching API. Because, for example, if you want to use cache tags, how many here are familiar with cache tags? So I'll explain it really quick. The idea with cache tags is if I perform a search, then I might get asset 12, asset 15, asset 20, asset 25. I can then tag that cached item with all of those IDs. So then if asset 25 is updated, it will automatically invalidate that search result because asset 25 was part of it. So you can, cache tags is going to actually be in Drupal 8 core. There's a really great presentation, Making Drupal Fly, with Wim Leers and Fabian. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you YouTube, check it out on YouTube. But yeah, that's definitely one of the issues as well.
Another one is the dependency on the clients module. This is one of the many HTTP client modules in Drupal 7. I think I actually set up a comparison page because there were way too many. Yeah, so I mean, that's a problem. What's funny is in the implementations that we saw, but you're actually calling Drupal HTTP request yourself in your own objects, in your own classes anyway. So really all the clients does here is it provides a way to associate your remote entity with an endpoint, like a REST endpoint or whatever you're using. The developer experience isn't great. There's some fixed code snippets that you need to stick in your custom module. You shouldn't really have to do that. That should be handled by the API. It's not. Another one is you define a remote entity query. That's one of the custom things you need to do. That's not really compatible with entity field query, which really does the work for views. So if we could make those a little bit closer, it'll trivialize the conversion, or maybe we won't have to do one at all. Performance nodes.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm sure, I mean, a lot of people sitting in here are probably like, yeah, but the performance must be crap, right? I mean, how many people are feeling that way? So it's true. It's totally true. It's like dealing with a really bad database server. I mean, that's the fact of it, because you're making calls server side to some random API and hoping that it's going to keep up. But you have to kind of put it in perspective. Slow query is a slow query is a slow query, right? I mean, you can complain about MySQL like being too slow, but MySQL is amazingly fast if you're not just sending it terrible queries. Poor network issues. You know, if you're having to go through some crazy old firewall and, you know, you're getting crazy latency from that, that's going to be an issue. And if your service is not sized adequately, if your API can't keep up, it's no different than if your MySQL server can't keep up. So some of the things you want to consider for this are, who here is familiar with static caching, that concept, where you basically, during a request, statically cache it so that you don't end up making the same request twice during one bootstrap of Drupal. That's critical for this, right? If you go to a remote source multiple times, it's going to totally kill your performance. In addition, entity caching is totally possible with this. But where this really starts getting kind of cool is when you start looking at the concepts of big pipe and render cache. How many people saw the Dries note from Barcelona? A few people? So the concept with big pipe is essentially that your page is always loaded, like your skeleton is always loaded like it's for an anonymous user. And then what you do is you define for all of the individual elements on the page, like, are they primary content or are they secondary content? This concept was pioneered by Facebook. And so if you go to Facebook on a slow connection, what you're going to see is you get the whole page, like just kind of the logo and buttons and whatever, you're probably going to get the very first post that would be in your feed, but then everything else will fill in with Ajax whenever it's ready. That's built into Drupal 8 core, and it's kind of the key to how Drupal can become, to the end user, appear to be extremely fast. Here, where we're dealing with potentially very slow external API calls, that kind of concept of pushing to the client side these calls that could make a really terrible end user experience is kind of the key for how you make it seem really snappy, but then all the secondary stuff just kind of loads whenever it's ready. Finally, one other note I want to make is you have to be really careful that you prevent requests whenever you can. So for example, we have user data that's remote, and what we did was we actually log in, we create a Drupal user so that we don't have to on every page load the user data from the remote source. So we actually save like the path to their user avatar in Drupal so that we don't have to ask the service on every page request, hey, where's their user avatar? Because if you did do that, you'd basically take the bottom line of how long it would take your page load would just be permanently increased by however long it takes to load that user object. Where's this? So I'll start off and then Connie. But kind of the bigger picture here, especially when you kind of say, okay, performance issues aside, those can be solved. What kind of starts to happen is if Drupal can treat any data source essentially natively, then Drupal kind of turns, it gets converted from this content management system into this almost like content hub system, right? Where you can basically have local data in Drupal, data from Twitter API, data from your in-house cloud API, data from some random, other service, node service you have, all being normalized in Drupal, all standardized as entity objects. And then you can use all the tools you want for page building. So your actual, we're not just talking about end user experience, we're actually talking about the site owner experience. Like your marketing admin who's going in, they're not having to say like, oh, this AngularJS thing's hands off, but I need to change with it. Everything, whatever tools you make available to them, they're going to be able to pull data from multiple sources and have it all be one standard workflow. That, to me, is a dramatic shift in how we think about Drupal, because a lot of times you think about Drupal as this kind of like, I've kind of got my main Drupal database and I'm going to stitch extra stuff into it. When you start thinking about it in this way, Drupal almost becomes this aggregating system where you can render data from any source, right? With all the tools that we've used to sell Drupal in the first place. I should also mention this is Drupal 8's. This fits right into Drupal 8's vision. Dries has been very clear that these client-side libraries definitely fit a use case, but they kind of sidestep all the stuff that makes Drupal great. And so a solution like remote entities kind of gives you the best of both worlds. However, it is going to leave you with a lot of complex technological problems to solve.
Another way to look at it is you can reduce dependence on external data sources. So let's say you have the data cached locally or saved locally. You can also, if your remote data source goes down, for example, then just use what's in Drupal. So that's another option right there. So steps to implement this. Create a custom entity controller. There is a remote entity one defined with a run entity API, but it may not do everything you need. You probably have to override some of that. Then you need to define how you connect to the external service. This is going to be very implementation specific. Define how to query it. That's remote entity query objects that I mentioned. You have to define your custom entities. So for those of you that have worked with custom entities before, that's you're implementing hook entity info, and you define how your entity works in there. Then you have to specify what your remote properties are. So I mentioned I say properties and not fields because pretty much everybody that's doing this, and that's probably 4 of us, are actually using Now you could do this with fields, but everything that's out there is using properties. In Drupal 7, you can have properties and you can have fields. So one thing in Drupal 8, they I think mostly get rid of properties, so you can just use the field API. The problem is in 7, fields aren't necessarily, they're not tightly coupled with the entity itself. They're sort of independent. So it would get a little bit trickier. That's why we're all using properties for this. You need to refine your Drupal integration points.
Yeah, like views and...
Views, that sort of thing. So although the core, basic things you need to do in Drupal should work, there are going to be a few other things you're going to want to hook up. If you're using, say, a bunch of custom modules that don't recognize this, say they assume you have a local database table, then that might be an issue. You might have to work around that. And then a caching strategy, as Dave mentioned, is really important. Otherwise, it's going to be rather slow. So to define a custom entity, here's the first bit of code we're showing. We'll show a little bit of this. We don't want to spend too much time on code, but just to give some idea of how to get started. So here's hook entity info, like I mentioned. So some of these things implement what's in core entity functionality, and other ones are remote. Core entity functionality, and then the entity API module, you implement stuff for that, and then you implement other stuff for the remote entity API module. So there's a lot of stuff in here, but let's see. So see it says base table. So you may not have that, right? Or you can have one that you're just using for caching. So that's one thing to see. See fieldable. In my implementation, I had false because I wasn't using fields, I was using properties. This is just a general example of hook entity info, but that gives you a rough idea of what you need to play with to change it. Right, okay, so here's how you do the custom stuff. Do you want to, Dave, this is yours?
Yeah, so we were looking at just a standard hook entity info before, which shows a node example. But here's the crazy part. So before we said base table equals node, here we actually can say base table equals null, right? That's crazy. This single line right here, base table equals null, messes up almost all of the contrib module integration you will see out there. Because they all will check to see if you have a base table because they assume you have SQL storage. So we'll kind of talk about that a bit later. But the whole magic of this is you don't have to, Drupal does not force you to have a base table. You don't have to save your stuff locally. You can also see here, I have view modes and I'm setting a controller class. So it's all fairly standard. It's just you're kind of getting a little wacky with it. Then you kind of get into these remote properties that you start putting in. And so, for example, with us, we actually define a property of remote base table. This is actually the string that represents the endpoint in our REST API, where we're making a request. So when I'm going to get an asset, I'm actually saying, oh yeah, I've got this remote table, and it's at assets/ID.
15 minutes left.
Yeah.
Do you want to do
Yeah, the one thing I'll mention about the controller class for the entity, remote entity API provides a default one, but if you want to do little weird things like change the save method, like in mine, I overwrote it just to set it to don't do anything because I didn't want to save it locally. So yeah, that's one little thing to know about that. We're going to skip over a lot of the code because we're running out of time. But you can override it, you can have a delete method, you can do remote delete, all that kind of stuff. So just speaking quickly about the connection class, that's how you define how to actually go out and get the data. So you're going to have a make request method most likely, that's very implementation dependent, so that's going to be different for everybody, so we don't want to show you an example for that. A, it'll take longer, and B, you're going to do something different anyway. Query class, so that is your remote entity query, and that's also, so that's another thing you have to write. It's a little bit custom. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the views integration right now. So to do that, you need the entity field query views backend module. So just to give a bit of history on what that's about. Way back in the day, views was written to assume that you had an SQL backend, you were doing everything in the local database. So at one point, someone needed to support MongoDB, which is local, NoSQL, different type of database kind of thing. So ESQ views is written for that. And it sort of broke some of the assumptions, like it replaced views storage engine with one that didn't make the assumption about it being local SQL database. So what I actually ended up doing was I took that over for a little bit and added remote entity support. So there's a little bit of code I'll show you later, but you can now, it should now work with MongoDB, it should work with remote entities. So that's great. The one thing you need to do is implement this build from EFQ method right now. What that does is it'll convert an entity field query, which this module uses, into a remote entity query, which you need to go out and grab your data. So when you're actually creating the view, make sure you use the EFQ version of your entity. You'll see, if you have this module installed, when you go to select your base entity, you'll have the regular version and then the EFQ version. You need the EFQ version. You have to do a little bit of conversion in this build from EFQ method.
Let's mention something.
You want to?
So the query class is actually kind of the magic to all this in a way. So you have already in PHP a MySQL class that understands how to take some sort of query object and convert it into a MySQL query. Similarly, what you have to create here is something that's going to turn an object, a query object in Drupal, into a query for your whatever you're querying. So for a REST API, for example, what we actually have to do is we say, this is not really semantically correct, but we have a property condition of time yesterday and user equals 1, 2, 3, 4, and then our query class actually converts that into a REST API string. Similarly, this is how we got saving to work. We actually take an entity object and then do a recursive function that converts the whole object into a string. So in your entity thing where you have like, asset title equals, whatever, then it converts that into your REST API string when you make your post.
Yeah, and this,
you were asking earlier, like, where do you define your entity? You're actually going to define all of the properties for your entity in, I believe it's called entity property info. And so you can see here, asset name, we have the label, the description, and then the type text. And then the next one, version, we have the type decimal. So this is where you actually have the ability to let views know, hey, I'm dealing with a string, or I'm dealing with a boolean, or a date, or whatever.
Right, okay, so this is just to give you a quick understanding of what ESQ views does. This is the code I changed, where originally it would do a query to find out how many results there are, then use that, it would go out and get the data, but you can't do that, you don't want to have two calls, right? So what we do is if it is remote, if you're using remote entity and you've got that type of controller, then just go out and grab all the data at once and then you're done. Then you have to do your own caching. Okay, so let's move on a little bit since we're running out of time. Drupal 8, we're all interested in finding a great way to do this in the future, and Drupal 8 is coming around the corner, so we're going to talk a little bit about how that's rolling out. So we've got a better entity API. There's no more hook entity info. Everything's a class. Everything's object-based. Like as I mentioned, fields are bound to an entity type, so you can do that all at once. That's much easier. No more properties. Guzzle, which is a PHP library that makes it really easy to work with remote services, is now in core. There's a great DrupalConf video that I haven't watched yet. Entity stored the Drupal 8 way, so that's what we need to do to get this working in Drupal 8.
Yeah.
So as far as Drupal 8 contrib goes, nobody's working on the remote entity API in Drupal 8. There's an issue open for that. Nothing's really happening. The maintainer or the author said he's not going to be working on it. There's a new module called external entities, which some folks are working on. It's got some code in there. It just doesn't have a release yet. I took a quick look at it. It's basically doing a lot of things we're talking about it, but I haven't done too much Drupal 8 work yet, so I didn't quite understand all of it, but it does definitely looks promising. As far as the EF2 views goes, to do the views integration, there's a new branch but no code, so we're going to have to figure out how to get that integration working. If we're not using remote entity API, we have to support another module, possibly external entities. So the time will tell on that one. And as far as Drupal 7 resources go, there's my article, which when we post this, you'll be able to link to that. These are links. Dave's talk in Barcelona, that's a video on YouTube you can watch. He does a really good job going further than I did on my article. The remote entity API itself has a reference implementation, the MS Dynamics client connection. So that'll help a little bit if you want an example. And then the book I mentioned, Programming Drupal 7 Entities, also has its own example and tells you how to get that done. So where do we go from here? That's up to all of us. We'd like to know, does anyone have any thoughts or questions or ideas? Are there any core maintainers here that have thoughts on this? Anyone?
Who would do this? Like who genuinely thinks this?
Who genuinely thinks this could solve a problem for them? Cool. So, how many people here have done this? I see some magic fingers, yeah.
Maybe one or two? Or
Right.
pass the mic around?
Yeah, so does anyone have any questions or any comments or, yeah?
Just briefly, how do you deal with the changes to your remote things?
Oh, we can repeat it. Or you can do it, yeah, you can do it game show host style. There we go.
Just really quickly, how do you deal with changes to your remote data source if in letting Drupal know that something's changed externally or handling situations where you're not querying necessarily the Drupal implementation you showed, but something external has changed?
Sure. Here. Yeah, we might just have to repeat the questions.
We are lucky enough that our external service actually has a notification service that we can subscribe to that lets us know when things have been edited. So that's really, for us, the only way we are aware if something has changed outside of Drupal. Now, if you're dealing with a remote storage system that you are the only client of, then you can do all your invalidation just through like your controller.
In my case, actually, the data was always fresh because we weren't storing anything locally. The cache time the expiry time was 0, and we actually didn't save anything. So every time someone accessed data in Drupal, it would always go out and grab it. Any other thoughts? Okay. 1 second.
Getting your workout in.
Thank you. I'm thinking of in the other direction where we know the information is going to change frequently, specifically Nextbus for anybody who uses that service. The information can be counted on to be refreshed about once per minute. Does this support that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, you can just set the expiry time to 0 or not use it, so you can always be getting fresh data. You're really going to hamper performance if you do that. So, that's the trade-off.
Yeah, I mean, you can set your cache expiration time to 1 minute. That's the beauty of having your own controller.
Yeah, so Dave was just saying, set your expiration time to 1 minute. In your identity info, you define what your expiry time is. Any other thoughts? Please, we need some help in making the standard in Drupal. No? Yeah, here's one, back.
Any integration with the request responses that are not modified? So we'll use local stores, tag or tender caching?
Right now, the question was, is there any integration with, I guess, other types of caching?
HTTP response that's like
HTTP response not modified. Yeah, there's no, as far as I know, there isn't any of that, but you have to do it yourself and build your own integration. Like one of the things we'd like to see, we were talking about this earlier, was to have this integrated better with the built-in Drupal caches, like coming in Drupal 8, the cache tags, that kind of thing. So right now there's not much of that, but like that's a great idea. Please help out with that. It's something we all want to see.
So, how would you deal with the entities in Drupal? For example, a user wants to type an article or something that you bring from your external. How would you deal with that? Would you make relationships with your entities in Drupal and external?
You mean like entity reference?
Yeah.
So yeah, the question was, how do we integrate that with other local items? Like if we're doing entity references?
Yeah, I can show you that real quickly.
So what we're looking at right now is part of a controller for remote entities. And what you'll see here is the save method calls the functions field attached presave and field attached update. So what this means is that you can add just local field API fields, and even though the entity isn't being saved locally, your fields are being saved locally. And when your field is saved, if you look at the field table, you're going to see it says entity type and entity ID. And those will be your remote entity information. And so that's how it knows how to stitch those together. But you can see we're actually not performing any sort of saving. We just call this remote save method, which then does all your remote saving. And so that's how you stitch the two together. The key to it is that you declare your entity ID to Drupal, and then Drupal just assumes, oh, hey, I've got an ID, I'll just save it wherever. Any other questions?
Did you want me? Oh, well.
Take a break.
I don't know, Dave. I mean, with the views example that you showed, is there a way that you can create like a no external resource? I mean, I'm talking about replacing the node entity and the Drupal system with an external node entity. Would that be possible?
So I guess my question would be, why would you want to replace nodes and not just have a new custom entity?
I have a system that is really, really huge with the data. I'm talking about millions of documents, and unfortunately, my SQL is not like fully able to control. The performance is really slow. So they're talking about implementing a non-SQL probably resource to make that happen, have better performance. The issue is that they want to save all the information in the non-SQL database instead of using Drupal, and only use Drupal as the front end for that part. So, I mean, the remote entity probably would be a nice solution for that, but I'm talking about The only issue that I'm seeing is that when they try to access the information, I will have to create custom paths for something that I do not have in the database. I mean, in that case, what would you guys would do on that part? I mean, any suitable solution? Do you think that, I mean, do you see a future in that solution that they're talking about?
Yeah, so I think what you're hinting at, and this is one of the pains Colin and I both had, there is so much you have to do yourself. Like URL alias integration, right? Like path auto, any sort of access checking. If you're doing caching locally on the response, you basically have to replicate all the access checking that normally your external service would do for you, because now you're just doing it all locally in Drupal. So when we're talking about like where we take this in the future, these are things that if this is going to be a true solution, like we need to provide, if not an implementation, at least strong examples on how we would do it. But personally, I would try and avoid just kind of like replacing nodes, because but Colin had an interesting idea too, if you want to talk about where you could basically like save your data locally. Like you could use this as a path to migration.
Yeah, the one thing I was thinking was, if, you know, when you create content in Drupal, it's automatically, by default, local data in your SQL database. But what if, when you went to create content, there was a chooser and you could pick, well, is this local data or do you want a remote? I mean, that would be kind of nice, wouldn't it? Because that way, it doesn't matter where the data is, Drupal can still work with it. So, you know, I think that's at least my vision for the future. We could do something like that. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be really great. Maybe, you know, if that's something we work towards, then I'd love to see it.